Hello everyone and welcome to episode 38 of the Card Combo Show with me, Chocobilly, where we look at the weird and wonderful card combinations in the Final Fantasy TCG. Make sure to like and subscribe. Now let's get the show on the road. So this week I'm going to be looking at the likes of Al-Cid from Opus 2, Shadow from Opus 4, Bhunivelzw from Opus 13, Celestia from Opus 13, and Black Mage from Opus 11. So first and foremost, Al-Cid. Do you remember when this card used to be in like every lightning deck ever, and now he's nowhere to be seen? I never see this card anymore. But he's one of those cards that I think over time he will get better, due to the fact that obviously he can play lightning cards from hand, and the more cards that come out, the more he can play, the better he gets. Obviously he has a stipulation that he can only choose an active forward to deal damage, and then it has to be a lightning forward of 3 or less that he plays from hand. So there's quite a few restrictions, and he only deals 6k damage as well. But still, I think he's still a viable card. He's a 4CP 6k forward, with the text, when Al-Cid enters the field, choose one active forward your opponent controls. You may play one lightning forward of cost 3 or less from your hand onto the field. If you do so, deal it 6,000 damage. So, Freya, this guy, I mean Al-Cid used to be always played with Onion Knight, the Sage Onion Knight and Lightning, but there's better options now in my opinion. So Freya, who has the ability to choose one active forward, deal at 4,000 damage. So that, on top of the damage Al-Cid would deal, is a total of 10k damage, which is pretty respectable. And also Freya is also a 7k forward. What's also good is the fact that there's so many multi-element forwards in the game now. As they have lightning in them, it means that Al-Cid can play Freya even though she is technically water as well. Urianger. So when Urianger enters the field, you may play one monster of cost 2 or less from your hand onto the field. When you do so, choose one forward opponent controls, return it to its owner's hand. So this is good because obviously Al-Cid will deal damage to something, which combined with other things may hopefully kill it, and then Urianger also gets to bounce something as well and bring in a monster, and again Urianger is a 7,000 power forward, so he's got a respectable power. Now you combine this with something like Propagator. At damage 3, you'd actually be gaining 3 forwards just from playing Al-Cid, which is pretty cool. But also, when Propagator enters the field, choose one forward, it loses 2,000 power until the end of the turn. So if you choose an 8,000 power forward with Al-Cid, and you bring in Propagator, it's dead, which is pretty good. Tonberries, so similar sort of thing to Propagator, but obviously when Tonberries enters the field, it minus 2,000 power to a forward, but then you can also put it into the break zone to minus another 2,000 power, and if you want to pay one water, you can actually make it minus 4,000 power, so dealing 6k damage with Al-Cid, and then minus a total of 6k with Tonberries, and also Urianger gets to bounce something as well. Bomb, so again a similar sort of thing. You can put Bomb into the break zone to deal 3,000 damage to one thing and 2,000 damage to all the forwards your opponent controls. So obviously Al-Cid will deal 6, and then Bomb will deal 3 and 2 to something. So that's a total of 11k, which is again pretty good. And it also deals damage to all your opponent's field, which you can then combine with something else if you wanted to. Null. So when Null enters the field, select one of the 2 following actions. Choose one forward other than Null you control until the end of the turn, against plus 2,000 power and haste. So you could use that to give Al-Cid haste if the 6k damage was enough to just get something out of your way. Or you can choose up to 2 forwards, deal them 2,000 damage and dull them. So obviously Al-Cid will come in and deal 6, then Null come in and deal something 2. So that's still pretty good as well. What's good about Null as well is let's just choose 2 forwards, deal them 2,000 damage and dull them. They don't have to be active. There's no stipulation on what he can pick. It's just choose up to 2 forwards. So they can have just 1 forward and you can just choose that one because it's up to 2 and then deal it to 2k and dull it. Glauca. The cost required to play your lightning forwards onto the field is reduced by 1. It cannot become 0. And when Glauca or a forward enters the field, choose one forward against plus 1,000 power until the end of the turn. So it's good because obviously it can make Al-Cid reduced in cost. And then if Glauca's already on the field, Al-Cid comes in, that's plus 1,000 something, and then the forward that Al-Cid brings in, that's again plus 1,000 something else, or, you know, Al-Cid can just play Glauca onto the field. Skeleton. So when a lightning character other than Skeleton enters your field, place one monster counter on Skeleton. So Al-Cid comes in, brings something else in, that's 2 counters actually onto Skeleton, which is good. If you played Al-Cid into Urianger into another lightning monster with Skeleton already on the field, that is plus 3 counters onto Skeleton, and then you can use Skeleton to put him in the break zone to break a forward of 4 or less your opponent controls. Okay, Shadow. He is a 4CP 7k forward with first strike and pay 2 fire. Remove 1 card from your hand from the game. Choose one forward, deal 1000 damage for each CP required to play the removed card. Now, with a lot of forwards these days, they are getting much higher in power, so they'll become hard to kill through these sorts of effects. And also, Shadow is quite strange because he's actually removing a card straight from your hand from the game. There aren't many cards that do that in this game yet. There's things like Kate Sith, where you get to look at your opponent's hand and remove a specific card, provided it's not a backup, but actually removing something from your own hand is kind of strange. And you want to make sure that when you're removing the card from hand, it's not something that you may need later to be able to retrieve to then either play on the field through Phoenix or just general recurrence back to your hand. But yeah, so Interceptor, obviously Interceptor and Shadow is a given, right? But Interceptor always gets played with the 5 CP Shadow and not this old one. So be able to give Shadow haste and plus 1000 power is pretty good, because then he is a haste first strike at 8k, which, you know, that's a lot more viable. They can combine this with Cyan, so Shadow becomes a brave haste first strike with 8000 power. That makes him quite problematic for your opponent to have to deal with, and the fact that you can pay 2 fire and then just remove, you know, just a 2 CP card from hand, that means Shadow can then block for 2000 power more, sorry. Mutsuki, so when a forward opponent controls is put from the field into the break zone, activate Mutsuki. So it's just a good way to be able to reduce the, or I say reduce the cost on Shadow's pay 2 fire, remove 1 card from your hand. Obviously, if you're removing something, you probably want it to go towards killing something, at which point Mutsuki will then reactivate, so you're effectively only having to pay 1 for his ability. Filia, Ranger, and Bhunivelzw. This is more just to showcase the fact that there's a lot of high cost cards in the game now that are actually quite cheap to play, or very much worth it to play, but they also work alongside Shadow. So obviously Filia is basically Fire's Shantoto, but it being an 8 CP forward mean that you can just discard that, or sorry, remove from the game and pay 2 fire to be able to deal 8k to something on your opponent's field. And like Ranger and Bhunivelzw, they can actually go down in cost, so they're actually fairly cheap to play onto your field, but their CP value is still applicable to Shadow's ability. Iroha and Manasvin, just being able to buff up the damage that he can deal is pretty good. I mean, in regards to his first strike, it applies to all first strike forwards, right? But the fact that they're on fire is useful. But not just that, it's the fact that you can effectively, let's say you use Manasvin Warmech on Shadow, and then you pay 2 fire and remove just a 5 CP card from hand, so something like 5 CP Cloud. That does mean you actually be dealing 7 instead. Now you have paid 3 fire and now removed a card from your hand, which is 5 CP, but that's 5 CP and no other cards coming from your hand. Like if you play a 5 CP summon, you're paying the 5 CP, but then also the summon you're playing is a card also out of your hand, so you've actually technically lost 7 CP there, whereas this is just a case of you're paying 3 CP and then a card gone from hand, at which point you should be dealing a fair amount of damage, and the plus 2000 damage buff is pretty decent, especially when you're getting rid of slightly higher cost cards. Bhunivelzw, so is a 10 CP, 10,000 power first strike, so something of notability. With the text, the cost required to cast Bhunivelzw is reduced by 2 for each backup of a different element you control, other than multi-element. Damage 3, Bhunivelzw gains Brave, and Bhunivelzw can attack twice in the same turn. And at damage 6, when Bhunivelzw attacks, choose one character, break it. So, quite substantial abilities there. Now, a quick talk about its ability of the cost required to cast Bhunivelzw is reduced 2 by each backup of a different element you control other than multi-element. So multi-element means things that, or backups that gain an element. So for example, I believe the backup Kimari gains, but also Shantoto as well. So the 7 CP Shantoto backup also gains that, or gains the elements. Whereas if you look at the likes of Moogle FFCC, the job Moogle backups you control can produce CP of any element. Same for Class 4th Moogle and Chaos. They can produce CP of specific or any element. Producing and gaining this elements aren't the same thing. If it can produce a CP, then it actually doesn't count as multi-element. If it gains it, then it does. So if you had these 3 on the field, which I had a deck with this, actually did this, if you had these 3 on the field, that would reduce Bhunivelzw by 6 CP, even though they can all technically generate CP or element of any CP. You know what I mean. Vincent. So as you can see, a similar sort of effect. At damage 5, you can cast his Chaos S, which Vincent gains plus 3000 power. First strike, and when Vincent attacks, choose one character, break it. This effect does not end at the end of the turn, and I think I might have talked about this before. but you can cast Chaos twice, at which point when Vincent will become plus 6,000 power, still first strike, and when he attacks you can choose 2 characters and break it when he attacks. That's nasty. He becomes a massive forward that can break multiple things on attack, and it's characters, so you can break your opponent's backups as well. So you can have a party attack with Bhunivelzw and Vincent, and even if you've only used Chaos once, those 2 party attacking once is breaking 2 characters, and they are both 10,000 power forwards. That's nasty. Now, obviously Bhunivelzw can attack twice at damage 5, damage 3, sorry. Now, if you combine this with Chelinka on Vincent, it now means that both Vincent and Bhunivelzw can attack twice. And if you say you've used Chaos S on Vincent twice, that means if you party attack with Bhunivelzw and Vincent twice, you can actually break 6 characters over 2 attacks. That's disgusting. I mean, with one attack, unless your opponent has more than 3 active forwards, you can just break all their forwards, and then on a second attack you can break most of their backups. That's just grim. So yeah, being able to remove something obviously very, very useful, and Bhunivelzw with this card basically means that when Bhunivelzw attacks, you get to remove something from the game rather than break it. Rampare. Obviously this had to happen, but there's a slight twist here. So when Rampare is whipped from the field into the break zone, you may play 1 category 11 forward from your hand onto the field. And obviously when Bhunivelzw attacks, choose 1 character, break it. There's no stipulation on the controller of the character, so it can be your own characters as well. So you can attack with Bhunivelzw and break Rampare to obviously bring in Shantoto. But if Shantoto when Shantoto enters the field, select one of the 2 following actions. Choose 1 character of cost 3 or less in your break zone, play it onto the field, or choose 1 character of cost 3 or less your opponent controls, break it. So obviously you could use this just to bring in Shantoto and then hopefully still break one of your opponent's forwards. Or what you can do is you can bring in Shantoto and then use her first ability to choose 1 character of cost 3 or less in your break zone, play it onto the field to bring Rampare back onto the field. You can then attack a second time with Bhunivelzw to then break your Rampare a second time to bring another category 11 card from your hand onto the field. Golbez, another way to be able to break Golbez. I think this is the 3rd week in a row now I've featured this card. But it kind of fits as well, because with Golbez you're going to be playing a lot of multi-element backups, not actual multi-element. I have to stipulate that again. So like with Chaos, he can produce he can produce elements, but he doesn't gain the elements. So yeah, being able to play all these technically multi-element backups to be able to reduce Bhunivelzw's cost, but also it works towards Golbez, and Bhunivelzw can break Golbez, and yada yada yada. Celestia. She is a water ice 4 CP 9k forward that I absolutely hate. She is an incredible card, but I despise her. So the water characters you control cannot be broken by opposing summons or abilities that don't deal damage. When an ice character you control is chosen by your opponent's summons or abilities, choose up to 1 character, dull it and freeze it. So some just rancid abilities. Ash. So when Ash is chosen by a summon or ability of your opponent, Ash gains plus 3,000 power until the end of the turn. So obviously Ash with Celestia in the field means that it cannot be broken outright, similar to when the Razzler backup, how that interacts with Ash. So yeah, Ash cannot be broken by just outright breaking, so you have to deal damage to her, but obviously when you target her, she gains plus 3,000 power. If you combine this with Minwu, she becomes very hard to kill. Now obviously there are quite a lot of board wipe damage effects now, so something like Philia would get rid of her, but still, if you target her, she gains plus 3,000 power. Target her, if you have to do it multiple times, every time you target her, she gains plus 3k power, and that's just very hard to get around. Rosa, whenever a forward you control is chosen by your opponent's summons, you may draw 1 card. Now this pertains more to the ice part of Celestia. So when an ice character you control is chosen by your opponent's summons or abilities, choose up to 1 character, dull it and freeze it. So you are able, if you have an ice forward that gets targeted by your opponent's summons, you are getting to dull and freeze one of your opponent's characters whilst you're also gaining a card as well. So you're kind of pushing your CP advantage ahead of them even more so. Obviously your opponent's only going to do it if they really have to, especially seeing that, but sometimes that's the only way they're going to be able to get rid of Celestia because of her ability she doesn't deal damage, so you have to target with like an outright break, and that tends to be more summons than forwards. And yeah, just a great way to be able to break Celestia and you still get a card from it. Pretty good. Maybe you'll be able to draw another Celestia from the breaking of Celestia. That'd be quite amusing. Capricious Reaper. When Capricious Reaper is chosen by your opponent's summons or abilities, your opponent discards one card from their hand. Now, if you have Celestia and Capricious Reaper on the field, your opponent's obviously going to go, well, if I target Capricious Reaper, I will have to have something dull and frozen and discard a card. So obviously they're going to target Celestia. But if you use IMO, your opponent, say they cast on a 4-cost Odin, and they targeted Celestia, you're going to get to dull and freeze something. But you can then use IMO to change the choose from Celestia to Capricious Reaper. Now what this does, because Celestia's ability has stacked, where you get to dull and freeze something, you can change it from Celestia to Capricious Reaper, at which point Celestia's ability stacks again. And Capricious Reaper's ability also stacks. So now you have got 2 dull and freezes on the stack, as well as your opponent having to discard a card. And yeah, that's just disgusting. Your opponent has to get rid of Celestia, but they also have to discard a card, and you get to dull and freeze probably 2 of their backups as well. That's just horribly mean. What's also hilarious is the fact that you can use IMO to actually target the same card itself. So let's say for whatever reason your opponent was being silly and they accidentally targeted Capricious Reaper. Now you get to dull and freeze something, and you get to make them discard a card. You can use IMO to target Capricious Reaper again, the same card, at which point they'd have to dull and freeze something and discard a card again. And just for fun, why not throw Barrel Eye into the mix as well? When your opponent discards 1 or more cards from their hand due to summons or abilities, choose one character, dull and freeze it. So if you went from Celestia to Capricious Reaper with Capricious Reaper, Celestia, Barrel Eye, and you used IMO, you could change the target from Celestia to Capricious Reaper, at which point you'd get to have 2 Celestia procs to be able to dull and freeze something, a Capricious Reaper proc to make your opponent discard, at which point you get a Barrel Eye proc to then be able to dull and freeze something else. So you've got to dull and freeze 3 characters your opponent controls and made them discard, just from them targeting one of your ice characters and using IMO. Not bad. White Tigerless Economy. Yeah, it's got when 1 or more forwards you control are chosen by your opponent's summons, its effect is cancelled if your opponent doesn't pay 3. Obviously, you can combine this with Rosa as well, so you know they're targeting an ice forward you control. You get to dull and freeze something, you get to draw a card, and they also have to pay 3 to be able to actually get the summon to even happen. Yeah, it's just another way to be able to dull and freeze, but they also got to pay more. It's like adding a CP to the tax as well, but you get to freeze something as well. It might as well read, if your opponent doesn't pay 4, it gets cancelled, because of the fact that obviously the Celestia is getting to dull and freeze something. Emmet Selk. When Emmet Selk is chosen by your opponent's summons or abilities, remove Emmet Selk from the game. If you do so, play Emmet Selk onto the field at the end of the turn. At damage 5, when Emmet Selk enters the field, you may pay 1 ice. When you do so, select one of the 2 following actions. Choose 1 dull forward, break it, or choose 1 forward of cost 2 or less in your break zone, play it onto the field. Now, obviously Emmet Selk's ability isn't amazing, but what's interesting here is the fact that obviously your opponent can target Emmet Selk with anything just to get him to disappear, so it could even be something as silly as, I don't know, just like a fairy, just to activate him and draw a card. So that would obviously give you a Celestia proc to then dull and freeze something. Now you can actually dull and freeze one of your opponent's forwards, and then at the end of the turn Emmet Selk will come into the field. You can then pay the 1 ice. If you do that, you can then break the dull forward that you dulled using Celestia's ability when Emmet Selk was targeted. Cecil. So this is an interesting little combination. If possible, Cecil must block, so that's kind of crap, but if Cecil is dealt damage by a summoner or an ability, the damage becomes 0 instead. All the forwards other than Cecil you control gain 1000 power, and if they are dealt damage by a summoner or an ability, the damage becomes 0 instead. So, let's just think about that. If any of your forwards are dealt damage by a summon ability, the damage becomes 0 instead. However, when a water character you control, water characters you control cannot be broken by opposing summons abilities that don't deal damage. So, your opponents cannot outright break your forwards, or your water forwards, but they also can't deal damage to your forwards because the damage gets reduced to 0. So your opponents have very few ways of actually being able to break your forwards. Now obviously the problem with Cecil is the fact that he has to block, but if you have the means of dulling him out, with which there are quite a few, then that's perfectly fine as well. But what's also good is the fact that Cecil is now Diablos proof because of Celestia. And Celestia being a water forward means that her ability applies to herself, and yeah, this is just a horrible, indomitable field for your opponent to have to try and get around, because of the fact that they can't be broken through summons or abilities that deal damage or outright break, at which point they now have to deal with, they can either go through the means of damage or power reduction, or they just have to force you to block, or they have to find a way of blocking, just blocking you, or, I mean, it's just a horrible thing to have to deal with. Black Mage. So he's an interesting little backup with a really cool ability. Pay X, put Black Mage into the break zone. Cast one summon of cost X or less from your hand without paying the cost. Then return that summon to your hand after use instead of putting it into the break zone. So you get to cast a summon and it comes back to you, just boomerangs back, all for the cost of paying X and putting Black Mage into the break zone. Now what's good about this is the fact that he states X or less. So you could technically pay 5 CP and break your Black Mage, at which point your opponent does something to look at your hand and they see, you've actually got Diablo in hand, I'm going to get that out of your hand. And then it comes to Black Mage's resolution, actually you have a Brynhilda in hand as well, so then you can still cast that because it states X or less. So Zalera, choose one dull forward of cost 2, 3, 5 or 7, break it. So being able to pay just 1 CP and break Black Mage to then break something, which you can then pay 1 CP again to then use Zalera to break another thing, is very useful. I mean, being able to just pay 2 CP and break it back up to be able to break 2 things of CPs that are very heavily played, being able to break a 5 cost or 7 cost for paying 2 CP and breaking it back up is fantastic. Carbuncle. Select one of the 3 following actions. If your opponent has 2 cards or less in their hand, select up to 2 of the 3 following actions instead. Choose one forward, dull it. Choose an ice forward against plus 2,000 power to the end of the turn, or choose up to 2 character spell controls. Freeze them. So being able to cast this little guy twice for 4 CP and breaking it back up is not too bad. You can dull 2 of your opponent's forwards, and you can, freeze each of the forwards and maybe 2 backups as well. Or you could just go freeze 2 backups, dull a forward, cast it again, freeze 2 backups, and give my ice forward plus 2,000 power. The good thing about this Black Mage is the fact that there's modal summons, and you can recast them but choosing different options the second time around. Alexander, draw 1 card. If you've cast 4 or more cards this turn, draw 2 cards instead. What's good about him is the fact that if he is the 4th card, then you get to draw 2 cards. So hypothetically, you could use Black Mage to cast Alexander, being the 4th card you cast this turn. You get to get 2 cards to hand, and Alexander comes back to hand. You then cast Alexander again, and you get 2 cards to hand. That's not bad. Dryad, so choose 1 character you control. Again, this character cannot be chosen by your opponent's abilities until the end of the turn. So, being able to use Black Mage to keep on having Dryad come back to hand, just as, continuous protection is very useful. Obviously, it only protects against abilities, not summons, but either way, being able to just have that Dryad constantly in hand and your opponent knowing it's there can be very problematic. That, alongside the likes of Unsang Ganashi and other forms of protection, this means that your opponent's going to be very frustrated, and if you have a good field presence, they may forget that you just keep the Dryad in hand. Ejidu Marijidu. So, when Ejidu Marijidu enters the field, select one of the 2 following actions. Cast one summon from your hand without paying the cost, or choose up to 2 summons in your break zone, add them to your hand. So it's good to be able to play Ejidu to get some back to your hand, to then use Black Mage to cast it and then have it come back to hand as well. But what's also cool is the fact that you can use Black Mage to cast, let's go with a relatively decent summon, so 4 CP Odin, and then obviously it comes back to your hand. You can then play Ejidu Marijidu onto the field to then cast that summon again, and Black Mage obviously makes room for Ejidu Marijidu as well. Minwu, so you cast a summon with Black Mage, let's go with 4 cost Odin again, comes back to your hand. You attack with Minwu, you cast that summon again, let's go with 4 CP Odin. You get to break 2 things, that's not too bad, and your opponent also has a Minwu attack on the stack as well. But we can go 1 step further and add Iodalus to the mix. So you use Black Mage to cast the summon, it comes back to hand. You attack with Minwu, you cast the summon, and then before your opponent gets a chance to block with Minwu, you can then use Iodalus to cast the Odin from the break zone. Obviously it will get removed then, but you've cast the same Odin 3 times using obviously 2 backups, that is 2 of your backups broken, and an attack with Minwu, but that's still pretty funny. Kryl, the cost required to cast your summons can be paid with CP of any element. Now that's good, but obviously the good thing about Black Mage is the fact that you can actually cast a summon of any element using his ability. You don't have to pay fire into the X payment to be able to cast something like Amaterasu, which again is another great card to play alongside Black Mage to be able to keep that kind of protection in hand. But yeah, when you cast a summon, choose one forward, it gains plus 1000 power till the end of the turn. So using Black Mage means you can cast it once and cast it again, at which point you can choose forwards to gain plus 1000 power. But ultimately you can discard one summon until the end of the turn. Trial cannot be chosen by your opponent's abilities. So you can cast a summon to maybe combo into Kryl or something like that, but then that summon comes back to hand, which you can then use to be able to use as protection for Kryl. Now, yeah, you can use it alongside the likes of Titan, which obviously only costs 1 CP anyway. So you could, say, use Black Mage to cast Titan, and you give Kryl all the forwards you control until Brave until the end of the turn. So that's all your forwards, including Kryl, and then you can use the 1 CP from Kryl to give her plus 1000. And then you can, I don't know, draw a card, and then that comes back to hand, and then you can just discard the Titan if you need to protect Kryl, or you can cast it again, and all the forwards you control gain this forward can become dulled by your opponent's summons or abilities until the end of the turn, and you can draw another card. So Terra, when you cast a summon, choose one forward depending on controls, dull it. So obviously just Black Mage and Terra are a good combo because you can cast the same summon twice and get a couple of dulls off using Terra. If you use summons that do dull, say for instance the 2 CP Shiva, you can dull 2 forwards with that, then Terra gets to dull something, the summon comes back to hand, you dull 2 forwards again, and then you can use Terra to dull another forward. That is 6 forwards dulled, and it is only forwards unfortunately, but it's still kind of funny. Now you can combo this with the likes of Glacier Lavalus, where you get to make your opponent either discard a card, choose one forward, dull it, choose one forward, freeze it, or choose one dull forward, deal it 7000 damage. So what you could do is use Black Mage to cast Glaz, at which point you get a Terra proc, and let's say your opponent has 2 forwards. Use Terra to dull forward A, and then you, with Glaz, you make your opponent discard a card, and you choose forward B, and freeze it. Glazier comes back to hand. You cast Glaz again, you then can maybe make your opponent discard a second time. You get to dull the forward that got frozen initially with Terra, and then you can also deal 7000 damage to the forward you dulled the first time around with Terra. So, just to recap, you've dulled both your opponent's forwards, you have made your opponent discard 2 cards, and you've dealt 7000 damage to a forward which hopefully will have killed it. So for paying 6 CP and breaking it back up, you've made your opponent discard 2 cards, you've done unfrozen the forward, and you've hopefully broken a forward as well. That's pretty good. I mean, it's... Sometimes that might be too much heavy of an investment depending on what you're playing up against, but I think for 6 CP and breaking it back up, that's not too bad. Cool. There we have it, folks. Another episode done and dusted. Let me know some of the weird and janky combos that you guys have been playing with as well. Also, just let me know some of the games you guys have been playing. I've been struggling to find something to play recently. I've been playing lots of Final Fantasy 14. Obviously, been doing the Grandia challenge run on the channel as well, which I am struggling with at the moment because I've come up against a particularly hard boss. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.